Have you ever wondered why it feels like you've been carrying pain your whole life? Even pain you can't explain? Pain that doesn't belong to any single moment you remember, but feels woven into your blood, your breath, your being. It didn't start with you. It started long before you had a name, long before you ever had a chance to choose who you would become. You were born into their wounds, into the unfinished wars your parents never won, into the shame they never faced, into the loneliness they denied, into the rage they buried so deeply they could no longer hear its screams. And somewhere along the way, without anyone ever needing to say it aloud, you inherited it. Their pain became your blueprint. Their silence became your language. Their fear became the shape of your choices. You didn't inherit their dreams. You inherited their brokenness. And the worst part, you were too young to know the difference between survival and selfhood. Too young to realize you were adapting to their wounds, not discovering your own nature. You didn't betray yourself. You survived them. But survival has a cost. The child who adapts to brokenness learns to split in two, the self that performs to stay loved and the self that is exiled to the farthest corner of the soul. You became who you needed to be to stay safe. And in doing so, you forgot who you were before survival wrote your story for you. But the self you abandoned never disappeared. It never died. It waits, buried beneath the inherited armor, the learned silence, the mistaken shame. For the moment you remember, you were never meant to carry their damage as your own. This is where your real life begins. Not in becoming someone new, but in reclaiming who you were before the world told you to disappear. Because brokenness was never your legacy. It was only the inheritance you were given. And inheritance can be refused. At first, survival looks innocent. It looks like being good. It looks like staying quiet when the room grows heavy. It looks like shrinking when your presence feels too loud for fragile people. It looks like adjusting, smiling, smoothing the edges of your own needs until they are small enough to be tolerated. You don't even realize you're doing it. You think it's just who you are. Because when survival is demanded early enough, you don't experience it as a choice. You experience it as reality. You don't think, I'm abandoning myself to stay loved. You think, this is what love feels like. You don't think, I'm suppressing my truth to stay safe. You think, I'm just too sensitive. I need to toughen up. This is how survival becomes identity, not through grand decisions, but through small, invisible compromises repeated so many times they become the walls of your existence. Each time you silence yourself to avoid punishment, each time you ignore your instincts to avoid abandonment, each time you betray a truth inside you to preserve connection, you lay another brick in the house of the false self. A house built not for living, but for surviving. Psychologically, this is what Carl Jung described when he spoke of the persona, the mask you craft to meet the demands of the world around you. The mask that at first protects you, but eventually imprisons you. The persona is not evil. It is a brilliant act of psychological engineering. It is the mind and soul conspiring to stay alive in a system that would otherwise crush them. But when the persona becomes overdeveloped, when survival requires that you mask not just parts of yourself, but your entire being, you lose the living connection to your true self. You become an echo of what the environment required, an imitation of acceptance, a performance of safety. And the tragedy is, you don't know it happened. Because the brain's first task is not truth, it is survival. Neuroscience confirms what Jung intuited long ago. The human nervous system is not wired to seek authenticity at all costs. It is wired to seek connection, even at the expense of the self. The child will sacrifice almost anything, rage, truth, intuition, desire, if it means securing attachment. You didn't fail by becoming what they needed. You survived. But survival writes in scars, not in stories. It leaves you alive, but half remembered. It leaves you walking through your own life like a ghost wearing a smile. Present but absent. Performing but not belonging, even to yourself. And one day, if you're lucky, the persona cracks. Maybe through exhaustion, maybe through grief, maybe through a quiet, unbearable sense of, this isn't who I am. And when it does, you are faced with a truth more terrifying than survival ever allowed. You never really chose the life you're living. It was chosen for you. And now, you have to decide whether you will keep surviving at the cost of your soul or risk everything to find the self you were forced to abandon. Because the life you truly long for, the one that feels like home inside your own bones, was never built atop survival. It waits beneath it, beneath the armor, beneath the silence, beneath the mask, waiting for you to come back. You were never just surviving your parents. You were surviving everything that came before them. Their silence didn't start with them. Their rage, their shame, their fear of love. None of it was born fresh. It was passed down like a haunted heirloom, generation after generation, each link in the chain tightening a little more around the spirit. When you were born, you didn't just inherit their blood. You inherited their unhealed wounds, their unfinished mourning, their unresolved terror of being seen and rejected. And without anyone needing to say it aloud, you were given a task. Carry it, endure it. Don't make it worse by noticing it. You didn't just adapt to your family. You adapted to their history. Carl Jung called this the power of the collective unconscious, the deep psychic inheritance of all that has gone unspoken, unseen, unresolved through generations. You became not only the child of your parents, but the container for their unlived grief, their forbidden rage, their denied vulnerability. You didn't choose this role. It was assigned to you before you could speak. Psychologically, this inheritance works like an emotional DNA strand. Encoded messages passed silently through the nervous system, shaping your expectations, your reactions, your deepest beliefs about who you are allowed to be. You learned early to fear your own anger because theirs was uncontrollable, to silence your own sadness because theirs was too overwhelming, to deny your own joy because theirs had turned to ash. Their survival strategies became the soil you grew in, and no matter how much sunlight you sought, the roots twisted themselves around old, buried skeletons. You internalized their distortions without realizing it. You began to believe, I must be small to be loved. I must be strong so no one else has to hurt. I must not need too much, or I will be abandoned. But these beliefs were never native to you. They were grafted onto you by pain that wasn't yours, pain that belonged to people who didn't know how to name their own suffering, let alone free you from it. And the danger is this: when inherited pain goes unnamed, it doesn't just wound you, it becomes you. You start to mistake adaptation for identity. You start to think the numbness is just your nature. You start to believe you were born wrong, too sensitive, too angry, too needy, when in truth, you were only responding to an emotional environment soaked in unresolved grief. Generational trauma doesn't always look like grand betrayals. Sometimes it looks like a look of disgust you can't name. Sometimes it sounds like a sigh of disappointment you learn to dread. Sometimes it feels like an empty silence, so loud it taught you to disappear inside yourself. You were shaped by these ghosts, molded by their absence, as much as their presence. And yet, even if your roots were tangled in sorrow, even if you inherited gardens of thorns, you were never meant to stay there. The damage they passed down to you is real, but it doesn't have to be your legacy, because inheritance is not destiny. It's only the beginning of the story, and you have the power to decide how it ends. When you are taught to bury your anger, you don't just lose the ability to protest, you lose the ability to feel fully alive. Anger is not the opposite of peace. It is the guardian of your boundaries. It is the force that says, "This is who I am, and this is where I end." When anger is forbidden, you lose the compass that tells you when you've been hurt. You lose the fire that would have protected you from violation. You lose the power to say, "No, this is not okay." And in its place, shame blooms. A shame so deep it doesn't even feel like an emotion. It feels like the atmosphere you breathe. You don't just feel shameful about what you've done. You feel shameful about who you are. This fusion of suppressed rage and internalized shame creates a nervous system that is constantly at war with itself. Fight impulses crushed under the weight of fear. Flight impulses frozen under the pressure to stay good. Fawn impulses rewarded while the true self withers away. Neurobiology confirms what survivors have always known intuitively. When rage and protest are punished early, the brain and body rewire themselves for survival, not expression. You become hyper-vigilant, always scanning for danger, always anticipating rejection, always bracing for the blow that might come if you dare to be too loud, too real, too much. The cost of this adaptation is not just emotional, it is physical. Chronic stress responses lodged deep in the body. Unexplained fatigue that no amount of sleep can fix. Digestive disorders, autoimmune flare-ups, chronic pain, all the hidden scars of a life spent swallowing what was meant to be expressed. Psychologists call it toxic shame, the belief not just that you've done something bad, but that you are bad. And this shame seeps into everything. You apologize when you're not at fault. You minimize your success so you don't threaten anyone. You distrust your own desires, believing they are dangerous or selfish. You silence your intuition because trusting yourself feels reckless. This is not accidental. It is the predictable outcome of being raised in an emotional environment where survival required the murder of your own fire. And yet, the rage you buried never died. It became anxiety. It became depression. It became perfectionism, codependency, self-erasure. It became the gnawing sense that no matter how much you achieve, how much you give, how much you contort yourself, something essential is still missing. That something is you. The version of you that was never meant to be polite at the cost of honesty. The version of you that was never supposed to negotiate their own worth. The version of you that was born with fire in their chest, not chains around their soul. You weren't meant to be neutral. You weren't meant to be invisible. You were meant to be whole. And wholeness doesn't come from silencing rage. It comes from understanding that your rage was holy. It was the part of you that refused to go quietly into extinction. It was the part that chose survival, even if it had to scream from underground to do it. When survival demands that you bury your true self, what grows in its place is a mask. At first, the mask feels like protection. It keeps you safe. It wins you approval. It earns you a place at tables that would have rejected your naked soul. But over time, you forget it's a mask at all. You begin to believe you are the perfect child, the easy partner, the reliable friend, the one who never needs too much, never feels too deeply, never asks for more. You begin to believe you are the performance. Psychologically, this is the formation of the false self, a concept first explored by Donald Winnicott, a self constructed not from authentic being, but from adaptation to an environment that demanded something else. The false self is brilliant. It is a masterpiece of psychological survival. It learns how to behave, how to charm, how to belong, but it belongs only conditionally. It belongs only by betrayal, betrayal of your instincts, your needs, your rage, your soul. And somewhere, beneath the choreography of being good enough for others, your real self waits, not dead, but exiled. Healing, then, is not a process of becoming something new. It is the painful, sacred process of removing everything you were never meant to carry. It is not additive. It is subtractive. It is a death, the death of the false self. And it feels like death because, for a time, it is. When you begin to dismantle the persona you spent a lifetime perfecting, you lose the protections it offered. You lose the certainty that if you just perform well enough, love will be guaranteed. You lose the identity built on being small enough to be tolerated. You lose the safety of invisibility. And in the empty space where the mask once lived, grief rushes in. Grief for the years spent surviving instead of living. Grief for the child who never got to feel fully loved. Grief for the self you buried so long ago you forgot how to hear its voice. This grief is necessary. It is the bridge between survival and life. Carl Jung wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain, because the awakening of the real self requires mourning the survival strategies that once kept you alive. You cannot bypass this grief. You cannot skip ahead to joy without honoring the death of what is false, and the world around you will not always understand. They were comfortable with your mask. They benefited from your compliance, your silence, your false peace. When you begin to shed the false self, you threaten the illusions others still cling to. You become a mirror they would rather shatter than face. But this is not your failure. It is your liberation. Because the life you are longing for, the life that feels real and wide and terrifyingly alive, does not exist behind the mask. It exists only beyond it. Healing is terrifying because it demands the death of the identity you once believed was necessary for survival. But what dies is not you. What dies is the illusion. And what remains, after the mask falls, after the shame dissolves, after the rage is honored, is something older, truer, wilder than anything you ever learned to perform. It is the self you were always meant to be, and it has been waiting for you, patiently, faithfully, beneath the wreckage of survival. There is a part of you that has never been broken, a part that refused to die, even when survival demanded silence. Even when fear taught you to betray your instincts. Even when love came with conditions that mutilated your truth. You survived by abandoning yourself. But you are not abandoned forever. The real self, the self before survival, is not lost. It is waiting. Waiting in the clenched jaw when you say, "I'm fine," and know you're lying. Waiting in the exhaustion after another day of smiling through betrayal. Waiting in the fierce, holy anger that rises when someone crosses a boundary you didn't know you were allowed to have. The self you buried to survive still remembers you. It remembers the dreams you silenced. It remembers the instincts you doubted. It remembers the fierce joy, the wildness, the hunger to exist fully and unapologetically. And it is not angry with you for leaving. It understands. It knows that survival demanded a mask. But it also knows that survival was only meant to be temporary. A bridge, not a prison. You have not failed by forgetting yourself. You survived long enough to have the chance to remember. This is the invitation now, to stop surviving yourself, to stop silencing your soul to appease ghosts, to stop mistaking the patterns of trauma for the patterns of truth, because you are not obligated to carry the damage you inherited. You are not bound to reenact the wounds you were born into. You are not required to live small to be safe anymore. Reclaiming yourself means grieving the life you lost to survival. It means grieving the loyalty you gave to systems, families, and expectations that could never love you fully. It means facing the terror of being seen, truly seen, not for what you can offer, but for who you are when you stop performing. It means learning to trust the anger that rises when a boundary is crossed, learning to trust the sadness that says, "This hurts," learning to trust the hunger that says, "I deserve more than survival." It means daring to want, daring to need, daring to exist beyond usefulness. Psychologically, this reclamation is what Jung called individuation, the process by which a person sheds the borrowed roles, the inherited traumas, the collective masks, and becomes whole. Individuation is not about becoming special. It is about becoming real. It is about returning to the source of your own being, the unedited, unnegotiated self that existed before survival edited your existence. And it is painful. There will be days when the mask feels safer than the nakedness of truth. There will be moments when you will grieve the simplicity of pretending. There will be seasons when loneliness feels sharper than the numbness of performance ever did. But this pain is not the pain of breaking. It is the pain of breaking free. Because the price of authenticity is high, but the price of self-abandonment is higher. You have lived long enough in the ruins of inherited pain. You have lived long enough bowing to survival at the cost of your soul. It is time, not to become something new, but to retrieve what was always yours. The right to exist without apology, the right to feel without shame, the right to live without permission. The self you lost was never truly destroyed. It was hidden, waiting, burning quietly beneath the rubble of silence. And now you are strong enough to come back for it. Not because you owe anyone your healing. Not because you need to prove you're good enough to be loved, but because your life belongs to you. It always has, and it always will. You were never broken. You were buried. Buried beneath their fears, buried beneath their shame, buried beneath the damage passed down through hands that had forgotten how to hold anything tender. You did not choose their wars. You did not consent to carry their sorrow. You did not ask to be shaped by pain you didn't create. And yet, somewhere along the line, you began to believe the inheritance was you. You mistook survival for destiny. You mistook silence for strength. You mistook self-erasure for maturity. But the truth is simpler and harder and more beautiful than you were ever allowed to know. You survived, and survival, brutal as it was, does not define you. It reveals you, because the self you lost was not fragile. It was fierce enough to endure abandonment. It was wild enough to smuggle its own fire through years of silence. It was stubborn enough to refuse extinction even when love came wrapped in conditions and survival came dressed as virtue. The inheritance you received was not your fault, but the reclamation, the act of refusing to live buried, that is your revolution. There is nothing small about remembering who you are. There is nothing selfish about refusing to disappear. There is nothing broken about a soul that still burns beneath the ashes. You are not a mistake. You are not a collection of wounds. You are not the survival strategies you had to perfect just to stay breathing. You are what remained unruined. You are what refused to die. You are the hunger for a life that feels real, not because it is easy, but because it is yours. And when you stop surviving yourself, when you stop apologizing for existing, when you stop wearing masks that cost you your own reflection, something ancient stirs. The soul that was never forfeit. The life that was never truly lost. The fire that was never truly extinguished. It was never too late. You were never too far gone. You have only ever been waiting for the moment you remembered that inheritance is not destiny. The damage left in your bloodline is real. The pain you carried for them is real. But the life you build from here, that belongs to you alone. You were not born to finish their suffering. You were born to break the cycle. You were born to live